All right. Well, hey, I'm glad you guys are here today to finish up the series we've been in. I do want to say real quick regarding concession stand. We've talked about it a ton. I talked about it last night. I'm not going to belabor this, but I talked about it last week. But a really cool thing happened this past Sunday, good grief. It's going to be one of those days. This past Friday, when we were at the concession stand this week, the athletic director came up to me at one point and was like, "Hey, we've got a photographer here this week, and they're going to be taking some pictures because we want to put some stuff on social media about you guys." And turns out that I didn't realize this at the time, but that's the only reason they hired a photographer, was to come in and take some pictures of our team, and because they want to be able to tell people how grateful they are for what we've done for the school. And it's a pretty cool thing when a school district talks about a church. It doesn't happen very often. So for those of you that have served, thank you so much. It's made a huge difference. Big shout out. Vanessa did this in Huddle, but big shout out to Blaze. Who is he in here? There's Blaze. Blaze made about 600 cups of hot chocolate and coffee this week. He loves attention, so killing it, Blaze. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. So we do have one more game. If you're available, we would love to have you. If not, do not sweat it, but we got one more. We're going to make it happen and have a great time this Friday. Now, today we're finishing up the series we've been in the last few weeks called The Fall of a Nation. And this is one of the sub-series of the story, and I think pretty much everybody here is aware of what we're doing with that, but just in case there's anybody tuning in online that is not aware, we have been spending we've spent several months now walking through this book called The Story, and this book is very cool because it is the Bible, but it is the Bible in a slightly more condensed format and in chronological order, so it reads more like a novel, which is one of the things that can be challenging with a regular Bible, is that it doesn't read like one story, but it is one story. And so we've been working through this, and we've had several different sub-series within it, and we're in the middle of it right now. We're in chapter 17 this week, and this is the portion of the Bible that more than anything else can be very depressing. It can be very frustrating. It can be very defeating because it's full of no good news, just none. And the hard thing about that is when you don't understand the context for why this part of the story matters, it can just really feel like God's cruel, that he's difficult, that he's like out to get people. But the reality is that's not what's happening at all. Now today is, just to be really blunt, today's kind of the lowest point of the story journey in terms of the, kind of what's going on with Israel. What do we see with God in this section? It's just, there's like nothing good. And to get you caught up, here's the timeline that we've looked at pretty much every week. This kind of shows where we've been. There we go. This kind of shows where we've been. We've covered creation, the fall, the flood, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Joshua. We've seen how God created us and wanted to be in relationship with us, and then we broke that relationship, and then God implemented a rescue plan, and all these different people, God was trying to get his people back. And he was trying to do it through this one family. And he said, I'm going to bless you so that you can bless the whole world and kind of be my representatives so the world will know how much I love them. And the best that it ever was came under David. There in about 1000 BC, we got Saul, David, Solomon. Saul wasn't great. David was pretty great. And then Solomon, his son, was kind of okay, but there were some cracks in the kingdom. And then right after that, the kingdom divides. There's civil war and there's unrest, and God's desire for his people to be his representatives in the world, they're gone. And over the course then of several hundred years, what we see is there's the fall of the northern part of the kingdom of Israel in 722 BC. And then today we're going to see the fall of the southern part of the kingdom, Judah, in 586 BC. And so at this point, we're 400-ish years from David, from the height of it, where it's been 400 years. And unfortunately, what has happened in those 400 years is there's been king after king after king after king after king. And in the northern kingdom, all of them were wicked. And in the southern kingdom, every now and then there'd be a good king. They do the right things. And last week, we looked at a king named Hezekiah for a few minutes. And Hezekiah was a good king. Hezekiah did what most of the other kings weren't willing to do. He tore down some of the high places. He tore down some of the kind of places of cult worship that were still present in Israel. And although there were some bad things that happened during Hezekiah's reign, God was faithful to Hezekiah. And there was an empire to the east who came in and conquered most of the southern kingdom. But because of Hezekiah's faithfulness to God, God preserved the capital city, Jerusalem. He saved Jerusalem because of Hezekiah. But as we enter into chapter 17, we see the same pattern kind of happening again and again and again. To kick off chapter 17, we're introduced to a man named Manasseh. Manasseh is the son of Hezekiah. And Manasseh becomes the king of Judah, and Manasseh, like most of the kings in Judah, the good king's sons didn't tend to be good kings. And Manasseh is no different. He's wicked, and he actually rebuilds many of the high places that his father Hezekiah had torn down. Things get so bad with Hezekiah that at a certain point in time, Hezekiah sacrifices, he kills his own son at one of the high places, which is the number one thing that all the way back into the book of Judges that God said he detested. And then he goes and he rebuilds an Asherah pole on the temple. I mean, Hezekiah, for all that he did, apparently was not a very good father. Manasseh, sorry. Well, Hezekiah was not a good father. Manasseh was a terrible son and did everything wrong, just everything wrong. As it happens, eventually, there's a prophecy. God begins to just get so frustrated with all that's going on that he had promised to preserve a remnant, and then he's to the place where he's like, I can't even do that anymore. We've got to do something totally different here. Over and over and over, God's been just trying to get the attention of the kings, trying to get the attention of the people. They're not paying any attention. They're not listening to him. They're not trusting him. And so finally God says, look, I'm going to destroy the remnant that I have preserved. And at this point, Manasseh is actually captured by the king of Assyria. And in a moment of wisdom, Manasseh humbles himself before God. He goes, okay, I get it. He turns to the Lord and begs for forgiveness, and the Lord restores Manasseh. But it's short-lived because Manasseh's son is also a wicked king. Amon becomes king, and he does not humble himself before God, and his reign doesn't last super long. And then his son Josiah is a good king, but his son Jehoahaz is evil, and then his son Jehoiachin is evil. And it's at this point in about 586 BC that a new king emerges in Babylon named Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar decides that he's had enough of the Israelites. And so he marches on Jerusalem. And at this point, you got to understand that Jerusalem is all Israel has left. It's it. The northern kingdom has been defeated many years before at this point. The southern kingdom, all the kind of rural areas have been defeated. The other cities have been defeated. Jerusalem is all that's left. The capital, the city of David, named for King David so many years before. It's it. There's nothing left except Jerusalem. It's where the temple of God is. I mean, it is the crown jewel of the nation of Israel. Well, Nebuchadnezzar comes and he defeats the city. He decides to leave a lot of the city standing, but he conquers Jerusalem. In 586 BC, Jerusalem falls, and Nebuchadnezzar takes the king, takes Jehoiachin back to Babylon, and takes the majority of the people in Jerusalem with him. Now understand that when this happens, the goal, 2,500 years ago, the goal when you conquered a neighboring nation was to assimilate those people into your culture so they lost their identity, in this case, as Israelites and became Babylonians. That was the goal. And so when they take all these Israelites and bring them to Babylon, the goal is that Israel will be wiped from the face of the earth, not just geographically, but as a people, they will cease to exist. It doesn't work exactly how Nebuchadnezzar wants. And unfortunately for him, there's still enough Israelites who live in Jerusalem that are still proud of their city and proud of their people. But in the midst of this, some interesting things happen. One of which is that there's a young man taken from Jerusalem to Babylon by the name of Ezekiel. Ezekiel would go on to become one of the most famous prophets in Israel's history. There's a long book that he wrote in the Bible by his name. And Ezekiel is interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that Ezekiel was really the first prophet to give these like weird apocalyptic kind of prophecies. Like if you're into some weird images and some weird monsters and creatures, and read Ezekiel. There's some interesting stuff in there. Some very odd stuff. It can be a bit jarring at times, but Ezekiel's primary message as he begins to rise in prominence amongst the Israelites in Babylon is very simple. It's doom. It's just doom. It's hopeless. It is God is going to utterly destroy Israel because we've been so unfaithful to him. It's not encouraging. It's terrible. And as this is happening around the same time, there's also a prophet on the rise back in Jerusalem by the name of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah similarly would go on to become one of the most famous prophets in Israel's history. And similarly, Jeremiah's earliest prophecies are of kind of doom and destruction. In fact, one of the prophecies of Jeremiah is that if God could find only one righteous person in the city of Jerusalem, he will spare it. He'll save it. Just one. But there's not even one person left in Jerusalem that's righteous. And so eventually Nebuchadnezzar decides that he's going to march on Jerusalem again, but this time, it's with a different goal. It's to destroy the city from the face of the earth. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem the first time, he took the king back to Babylon with him and appointed a new king, but it was a king that was a regional king under Nebuchadnezzar's reign. That king decided that he was going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar comes with the full force of his army and besieges Jerusalem for 2 years. And in that time, Israel has no money, they have no food, they are completely and utterly devastated. And after 2 years, they finally completely overthrow the city, and Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and his armies destroy the walls and burn the city to the ground. And the crown jewel, the city of David, the capital, the only thing that Israel had left is gone. Now, I don't want to understate just how severe things were in Jerusalem at this time. I've always thought that if somebody would take the Old Testament of the Bible and make like a series of movies or a TV show out of it that was actually realistic and true to the narratives, it would be a phenomenal TV show because it's all the things that people love in period dramas, but it was real. It was real. And in this case, picture whatever movie maybe comes to mind or whatever TV show comes to mind where there's a city that's just been utterly ravaged by war, it's that. The walls are rubble. The temple is burned to the ground. There's nothing left. In fact, Jeremiah, he wrote 2 books in the Bible, one called Jeremiah and then one called Lamentations. And Jeremiah began to write the book of Lamentations after the point in time where Jerusalem has been burned to the ground, and Jeremiah has actually fled Jerusalem with a handful of Israelites and gone to Egypt to try to just find protection from Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And as he does, he begins to write this book called Lamentations, which is a prophetic book, but more than that, it's a book where Jeremiah is just lamenting, grieving, very outwardly expressing all of the pain that's in his heart for what's happened to his home and his people in the city that he loves so dearly. It's an interesting book because it's a book that I think gives a lot of hope to those who struggle through life. And again, I don't want to understate just how bad things were in Jerusalem. In fact, what I want to do is just read some of Jeremiah's words about how bad things were. Because he was there, he saw it, he witnessed the destruction. And in the opening words of the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah writes this: how deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. And a few paragraphs later, Jeremiah begins to describe the depth of the suffering that was happening in Jerusalem and just how deeply it's impacted him. He writes, "My eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. They say to their mothers, 'Where is bread and wine?' as they faint like the wounded in the streets of the city, as their lives ebb away in their mother's arms." And this is powerful language. Jeremiah is saying, I've watched young children die of starvation in their mother's arms in my city. He says, what can I say to you? With what can I compare you, daughter Jerusalem? To what can I liken you that I may comfort you, virgin daughter Zion? Your wound is as deep as the sea. Who can heal you? A couple paragraphs later, he begins to cry out to the Lord and pleads for his city. He says, look, Lord, and consider, whom have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they have cared for? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie together in the dust of the streets. My young men and women have fallen by the sword. You have slain them. In the day of your anger, you have slaughtered them without pity. As you summon to a feast day, so you summoned against me terrors on every side. In the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. Those I cared for and reared, my enemy has destroyed. Look, I took a very small snippet of the beginning of the book of Lamentations, but this is all it is. I don't want to understate how severe the destruction was. That's as heavy as it gets. He's talking about parents eating their children because they can't find food. It's horrifying. And to think, for those that have been a part of the story, we think back to David and Solomon and, it's how far it's fallen. One of the things that I like about the book of Lamentations is that I think sometimes we think that we can't go to God with our pain. The book of Lamentations says strongly otherwise. Jeremiah lays his heart bare before the Lord. He pleads with the Lord because he is in so much pain over what has happened. But Jeremiah does something else that is significant. Just a few paragraphs later, I wanted to include all the verses leading into this, but, there's a lot already. Just a few paragraphs later, Jeremiah is continuing to lament, to grieve, to very openly describe to God just how devastated he is. And then, in a moment, Jeremiah does one of what I think is the most important and impactful things in the entire Bible. In Lamentations chapter 3, Jeremiah writes, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. What I think is so powerful about what Jeremiah does here is kind of twofold. Number one, Jeremiah is not pretending that what he has experienced, what he is feeling, what the grief that he is not pretending it's not real. He is not just pushing it to the side. He's not burying it. He's not pretending it is not severe. He is not hiding it from God. Jeremiah is actually known as the weeping prophet because he spent so much of his time just talking about how terrible everything was. And in this moment, Jeremiah is not hiding that from God. He's not pretending it's not real. He is very present and he's very content to sit in the reality of his situation and say, this is where I am. But he doesn't stay there. See, Jeremiah does a powerful thing in that Jeremiah doesn't allow what is real, he doesn't allow what is present to define what he believes is real. Rather, he defines what is present based on what he already knows to be real and to be true. And so rather than interpreting his current circumstances through the lens of the current circumstances, he's interpreting through the lens of what he believes is true about the God who is bigger than the circumstances. And so he sits in them and he says, this is terrible. God, how could you allow this to happen? And yet, here is what I know. The Lord is faithful. Here is what I know. The Lord will not fail. Here is what I know. There's something new coming in the future. It's a perspective that's hard to understand. On Friday this past week was a football game, and Brooklyn really wanted to go. Our oldest, she wanted to go to the game to hang out with some friends, and we've let her start doing that this year. And Brooklyn's a little social butterfly, so it's just the greatest thing in the world to her. So she really wanted to go, and we were kind of back and forth on whether or not we wanted her to because she had just been a long week and she'd been worn out. And Thursday she got home from school, and she was not in a good mood. And she chose to take that not good mood out on me, which is a little bit unusual, but she did. And so we had a little dust up, had a little argument, had a little some words thrown around from Brooklyn to me that were not okay. And it wasn't anything huge. It wasn't anything crazy. Brooklyn and I have had much worse arguments and fights at other times, but it was enough. And so, what I knew in the middle of it is as she's saying mean things to me that in about 10 minutes, she was going to circle back and be like, sobbing, Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean any of it. Well, about 10 minutes later, wouldn't you know, she circled back and, Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean any of it. I know. She likes to sometimes say, you don't ever care about me, right? And we're like, okay. And so she circled back. She said, Dad, I'm so sorry. I know that's not true. Like, yes. And as we're talking, I said, Brooklyn, I'm really sorry, but I think based on how you acted tonight, you're not going to be able to go to the game tomorrow. Like, no, Dad, I'm so sorry. Please, Dad. Like, no. And I said as calmly as I possibly could, Brooklyn, you and I are fine, and we will always be. There's nothing that you're ever going to do that'll make me love you less. But when you treat people in hurtful ways, life doesn't work very well. And so, I know you really want to go tomorrow, and I'm very sorry that you're not going to be able to, but I can't let you be hurtful and then just go on with life how you want. Now, for 11-year-old Brooklyn, this was a crushing defeat, right? It feels like I'm just trying to ruin her joy. And to be really honest, there was a huge part of me as a dad in that moment that was like, this really wasn't that bad, but it was. I'm not normally the softer one in the relationship, but I wanted to be like, it's okay, B, I know you feel bad. But as we all know, feeling bad doesn't change when you do things that wound people. And so I said, Brooklyn, I really would love for you to be able to go tomorrow, but it's not going to happen. And so next week, there's probably going to be another game, as it turns out there is. I said, Brooklyn, there's probably going to be another game next week. Learn from this. Don't make the same mistake next week. She's like, okay. Right. Well, what I knew in that moment was that Brooklyn has a choice, and it's the same choice that I've had many times in my life and that you've had many times in your life. And that's to look at the circumstances around us and choose the perspective in which we see them. See, Brooklyn could look at that conversation and say, my dad's so mean. It wasn't even that bad. I said I was sorry. I could have been meaner. Or she had the opportunity to say, I really messed up. And I wasn't even really feeling that big of things, and I still lashed out. So I need to make sure I get it under control next time earlier. Now, ultimately, I can't force her to choose the perspective. God can't force any of us to choose perspective. But what we see in this story, what we see in Jeremiah, is that Jeremiah had this incredible ability to look at the circumstances in front of him and say, as bad as this is, I know a thing that is true. And that thing is how I'm going to interpret this thing instead of the other way around. And the reality is in life, so much of where we go is determined by the way we look at our circumstances. The reality is in our faith, so much of our experience with God is determined by what do we know is true, and how do we then interpret our circumstances by what we know of who God is. Because if we allow the circumstances to define God, God ends up looking kind of terrible sometimes. And certainly in this circumstance, it would have been easy for Jeremiah to look at God as terrible. How could God allow this to happen in Jerusalem? How could God allow this to happen to his people? How could God do all this to Jeremiah? But Jeremiah instead chooses humility. He chooses to say, God, what I know of you is that you are faithful and you are good. And so if this is where we are, I know that there will come a day when you will redeem it, even if I don't know when that day will come. Now, one of the really interesting things to me about this is that this choice of perspective is a very similar thing to what's happening in a parallel story with Ezekiel at the same time. See, as word began to travel back to Babylon about what had happened to Jerusalem, Ezekiel gets word of it. And in an interesting shift, Ezekiel's prophecies of doom and destruction change. Not entirely, there's still some doom and destruction. Ezekiel really liked crazy monsters and stuff, so there's still some of that present. But Ezekiel's prophecies begin to shift to prophecies of hope, of restoration, of redemption. And it's an odd thing for a prophet exiled in a foreign country when the capital has been destroyed to begin prophesying of hope. But it's almost as if God was using these prophets to say, you are where you are right now, but I need you to remember that it will not always be this way. And so I want to read to you one of Ezekiel's most powerful prophecies of hope. It's found in Ezekiel chapter 37. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. Anyone of a certain age might well remember The Lion King, like the good one, the animated one, right? Not the live action one, that one's trash. The animated one. Remember when they go to the valley with all the bones? That's the image that I get in my mind, is the valley of the bones. There's not hyenas though in this story, so it's all good. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Then he said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound. That's why we sang that song this morning. There was a rattling sound. And the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he, being God, said to me, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breath from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may have life. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Man, did I say the Bible would make a good movie? I mean, come on, Then he said to me, son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. And can you blame them? We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. We have Jeremiah, we have Ezekiel, both prophesying about what the Lord is going to do. That in the midst of a time where the crown jewel, all of Israel has been destroyed, and at this point, not just all Israel, but the capital, the city of David, the crown jewel is rubble. We find both these prophets prophesying about something that's going to come later, about restoration and redemption and life in the midst of death. This is as bad as it gets for Israel. Good news, this is the low point, okay? It's going to get more hopeful from here. But in the very midst of the absolute worst, what God is saying through the prophets is this isn't the end. This is not the end. Because if you think back to the very beginning of the story, what has God consistently said to his people? I will redeem you. I will bring you life. I will. And in this moment, as the prophets are prophesying, and as they've shifted from doom to hope, the message is the same. It's that there is always hope when we believe that God will never fail. Always. This is what the prophets are saying. There is always hope. There is always hope. Why for the prophets is there hope? Because they have the perspective. They are able to look at the circumstances in front of them and say, but we know who the Lord is. We know what the Lord has said. And we know that when the Lord says it, it will happen. Period. One of the hardest things I think for us as people is to accept the reality that we don't always understand what God is up to. And that because we don't always understand it, it can be very, very challenging for us to see it the way it should be seen. Does that make sense? This is a difficult time of year for my family. This past Wednesday would have been my dad's 68th birthday. But 3 years ago, on November 16th, he went home to be with the Lord. And he had been sick for about 5 years, but had lived his entire life very healthy, and then got a disease that was incurable, and we just knew it was a matter of time, but we didn't know if it was going to be 1 year or 5 years or 15 years. As it turns out, it was about 5. And on the day that he passed, we didn't yet know exactly what was coming, but we knew that he wasn't going to make it. And so my sister and brother-in-law had come down from Mount Vernon, and they were at our house when our kids got home from school that day. And the kids knew that Pop was sick, but they didn't know how sick he was. And so they came into the house and immediately are like, what's going on? Why are Aunt Liz and Uncle Ryan here? And we kind of sat him down on the couch and said, guys, we got some bad news. You knew Pop was in the hospital, but Pop's really sick and he's not going to make it. And we don't know how long it's going to be, but it's going to be soon. And Brooklyn starts sobbing. And Mason started kind of crying. Mason doesn't always know what to do with his feelings, so a lot of times he just giggles. Brooklyn's crying, and she looks at me and she said, but Daddy, I prayed that God would heal Pop. My dad heart breaks at my 8-year-old daughter who had prayed for her pop that day. And in a moment of honest to goodness of wisdom that I don't know where it came from, I took Brooklyn's face in my hands and I looked at her and I said, you look at my face right now, you look in my eyes and you hear me. Jesus is about to heal your pop forever. And I said, whatever would have happened in this life, your pop would have been sick. But when pop goes home to be with Jesus, he'll never feel the pain that he's had these last 5 years again. He'll be free of it forever. Jesus is about to heal your pop. He's about to answer your prayers. And of course, we hug and she's sobbing and I'm sobbing and Mason's giggling. On Wednesday, she wanted to go visit Pop's grave, which is just around the corner from our house, so we went, and she's sobbing, and I'm sobbing, and Mason's giggling. I've had to remind her again and again and again and again over the years, as I've had to remind myself, that there's a perspective we can choose when we look at the circumstances around us. It's a perspective to say the circumstances determine what's real, or it's a perspective to say the Lord determines what is real, and I'm gonna interpret my circumstances through the lens of the faithfulness of God. For the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and for the people that they prophesied to, they never saw what the Lord said was gonna come to pass. Most of them died in exile. They never returned to their homes. They never saw the city of Jerusalem rebuilt. I didn't get to see my dad healthy this side of heaven. Whether in this life, though, or the next, the Lord will fulfill his promises to his people. And just like I've had to work with Brooklyn and remind myself time and time again, we don't always get to see the faithfulness of God in the way that we hope in the here and now, but we will see it one day. We will. Because what he has promised, he has never failed at. And when we don't see it how we want it now, the question is, do I trust? Do I believe? Do I know with all that is in me that even if what's happening now looks nothing like what I believe it should, that the Lord is still faithful? And when we have that, we have a hope that can never be shaken. That's what the prophets had. They didn't have a false sense that everything was good when it was terrible. They didn't just pretend life was roses and sunshine. I want to run us back to the words of Jeremiah the prophet in the book of Lamentations. And for those of us who are in a season of life that is challenging, I would encourage you to take these words, put them somewhere where you can read them again and again and again. For those who are not in a season that is challenging, take these words somewhere and read them again and again and again and again, because they are words that I have come to find great comfort in because of the way that they deal with what is real, but also deal with what is present and right now, but return to what is true. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind. This I remember, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, and I will wait for him. Let me pray for us today.